Today we're looking at the Knitmaster or Silver Reed lace carriage. In my case I have the mod 360/260L. Another model that may come up is the LC2, that's the more modern model. With the lace carriage set you'll get some of these wide weights as well as a selection of the edge pins. Now your edge pins may be like this if they're from the 260/360L, or they may be like this if they're from the LC2. So we're going to have a look at the cards first and we'll come back to the carriage. So you'll get a standard set of lace cards with the carriage, but you can also buy for the Knitmaster extra card sets. So we'll look at the original set first. So with the Knitmaster or Silver Reed lace cards, there are some differences in these. Like with most of the brand's punch cards, our number 1 starts 5 rows up from the double punched edge. We can tell they're lace cards because lace cards tend to have the least amount of holes punched. And within the set, when we look on the right hand side, we can see that most of them have just the column of rows, so the number of rows, but some of them actually have these red boxes in certain areas. So if we pull one of these out, the difference between these, this is a simple lace card and this is a fully fashioned lace card. What that means is the simple lace card, the carriage will transfer and knit in the same pass, and the fully fashioned lace card, we have to change a setting on the carriage, remove the yarn, and during these red areas the yarn is removed, the setting is changed, and this is where multiple transfers are made. One thing we have to keep in mind with the lace cards, on the left hand side it does tell us which way we should be moving the carriage. So for this simple lace card, which is L1 in the set, row 1 tells me that I should be starting moving the lace carriage from the left to the right. This is more so important to follow the arrows on the fully fashioned lace cards. If you don't follow the arrow direction, that's when you might start to come into some problems, either with the needles overloading stitches because they're not being able to transfer them correctly, or even possibly a carriage jam. Simple lace is not as bad, but it will cause a slight difference in the way that the fabric will look. Some of the additional sets that you can purchase, they may be completely fully fashioned lace cards, like we can see here. Most of these are fully fashioned lace, and then in some of the other sets they may be mixed, so you'll have simple and fully fashioned lace. But most of the extra sets will come with a small leaflet that will show you roughly what the example should look like. So we'll have a little look now at the lace carriage, and then we'll get on and show how to load the card and how to start off with some simple lace. Moving on to the carriage now, and you'll see a lot of similarities to the main carriage. So we have our patterning drums, stitch dial, side levers. We have an area for hold levers, but we don't actually have these, and it's a very important point that we need to take note of, is that the lace carriage cannot do hold. So important to note, do not ever place your needles in D position or hold position, which is all the way forward, if you're using your lace carriage. You will cause damage to your needles. So we have our stitch dial, and you'll notice that your stitch dial only goes up to tension 8. So again, very important if you're working on an all over lace project, particularly if it's a garment, that you swatch. Moving on from the dial, we then have our cam lever, and the cam lever can either change this from simple lace or fully fashioned lace. So when it's forward or in the O position, this will do either stockinette, because we can do stockinette with the carriage, or it will do the simple lace, which is to transfer and knit in the same row. If we want to do a fully fashioned lace card, which are the cards that have the red bars on the right hand side column, during the red bar areas we will want to be switching the cam lever to P. Now, one thing that you want to take note of is that as I change this cam lever setting, the row tripper here will engage and disengage itself. Please don't try to force this, because you will cause it to break. The row tripper is controlled by the cam lever. So when we're doing either stockinette or simple lace, it will trip every row, and when we have to do just the transfer sections on fully fashioned lace, it will disengage so as not to count up the passing of the carriage. So how do we get the two settings from the one cam lever here? Well, stockinette is controlled the same way as with the main carriage by the side levers. Now this is the patterning. This is what the carriage is going to say. I don't want you to read from the patterning, so in this case the side levers are on the dot, or I want you to read from the patterning, in which case the side levers would go back to the triangle. So in the dot, with the cam lever set to O, we'll knit stockinette. On the triangles, with the cam lever set to O, we will pattern. In this case, this will do the simple lace, and in this case, when we turn it here, this will do the fully fashioned. Now we will go over the fully fashioned. You'll have to switch back and forth with the cam lever, but we'll go over that once we move on from the simple lace demonstration. Ideally, when we're working with the lace carriage, it does tend to work better when the main bed is flat, because the garment or the fabric is created at 90 degrees from the needles. However, some people have had success using the lace carriage whilst the ribber clamps are installed at an angle. Some people put it down between both beds, and some people actually lay the lace over the front of the ribber. If you don't have ribber covers, then you can just lay a sheet over the ribber to prevent the fabric being caught on the gate pegs. So casting on, we normally start with the main carriage, primarily due to the fact that we can't use the needles in D position. And I found casting on without any waste yarn or weight at the beginning makes it a lot harder to get the lace carriage to knit those stitches off cleanly. So normally I like to start with a rag and Ravel Cast On. At the moment I've got my rag hung, needles are out to D position, and I'm just going to place my Ravel cord into my main carriage, which is set onto tension 10 for normal knitting, and I'm going to pass this across And now my needles are in B position. If I was to start knitting straight away with the lace carriage to do the stockinette, this would give me an open cast on. However, I don't want an open cast on. So I'm just going to remove the main carriage and bring down the yarn that I have pre-threaded into the tension mast. And I'm going to do a slip knot. So I'm going to wrap it around my hand, reach through the loop, catch that working yarn and tie the knot, and that way that allows me to adjust the size of this loop. And I'm going to bring all my needles forward to D position to allow myself to do a closed cast on, which in this case, to allow me to go back to B position before I start to use the carriage, I'm going to use a double E-wrap. So I'm just hanging a peg onto the tail so that I don't accidentally use the tail to start casting on, and we'll move in closer. So all of our latches are open. The slip knot loop is placed onto the first needle. You can decide if you want to pull out some excess yarn from the tension mast to prevent you having to fight the take-up spring all the time. So ensuring that you're using the live yarn and not the tail, we're going to come up between needle 2 and 3, lay the yarn over needle 1 on the left, and we're going to knit that back. And we're going to keep doing that all the way across, knitting back that first needle to B position. Make sure that you put the loops that you manually knit back, that they are evenly sized. If you make the loops too small, it may make the initial pass of the lace carriage quite stiff. But as long as you use both hands on either side of the handle with even pressure, moving the carriage sideways, it should be okay. So once we're on the last needle, we've already wrapped it and knit the second to last needle. We're just going to knit that off again, and then we're ready to go and thread the carriage. So when you're ready to bring your carriage onto the main bed of the machine, just bring it in from the edge, and just before it gets to the start of the needles in work, we're going to push it back slightly, and that will allow the yarn feeder to line up. You can move this piece, but it has a brush inside that sort of presses against the front of the hooks of the needles out of work, and if you constantly manually move that back and forth, then you're going to cause unnecessary wear. So it's just as easy to move the carriage to line up the feeder. So we're ready to knit stockinette. In this case, my needles are in B position. Make sure your side levers are to the dot and the cam lever is forward. This is the stockinette setting. And as you bring the carriage to the work, ensure that this, you can see it's just come out by itself, ensure that it has the correct tension in the take-up spring. So when you place it in, don't just lay it in and expect it to hold. You'll need to press in the bottom until you feel it sort of almost click into place, and then it's less likely to come out. So again, as we're moving forward to the start of the work, I'm just going to be hand tensioning here, but if you look up and your take-up spring is completely maxed out, then just reach to the back of the tension mast and pull down towards the cone the yarn so that it brings the take-up spring closer to the top of the tension unit. And again, both hands holding the carriage, even pressure, moving sideways. So I'm ready to load my simple lace card. Again, we know it's simple lace because there are no red blocks on the right hand side here. So I'm going to ensure that my card reader is unlocked, so back to the triangle position. When it's locked, you can see all of the plastic patterning teeth move in. That blocks the path of the card to be able to be fed in. So we're going to unlock, which causes the teeth to pull away. Then we're going to control the feed-in dial here. We're going to place the card in, and we want the column of holes here to catch into the feed wheels on either side, and use the red lines to ensure that you put the card in straight. And we're feeding it in until we see number 1, and we're locking the card. You can decide whether or not you want to close the loop. If you're doing a garment, I would recommend that you do that first, so you can feed it a lot further through. And just before it gets to the end of the card, you'll want to close off the loop. So we're taking the beginning of the card, but we want to put it behind the piece that's in the reader. The reason we want to do that is so that when it feeds through, it will feed through smoothly. If we put it in front, then this lip could quite easily catch on the inside of the reader. So we're going to put it behind. You'll need some card clips. I normally come in from behind, locate the holes, fold this over. Ensure that you have that done on both sides. And then you can go back to row 1, lock your card and carry on. Sometimes what I'll do is I'll load the card and start knitting, and as I get to the end I'll close the loop. But it's better practice to close the loop first, just in case you get carried away, particularly on a garment. You don't want to run out of the card. So I've only knit 1 row to start from the cast on, but now that I've loaded the card, my patterning drums are not loaded, so they don't have this pattern set into them, which is good because I'm currently on the left, and by passing from the left to the right, it would load my drums, and then I'm in the correct position to start the simple lace, because row 1 is telling me that the carriage should be moving from the right to the left. But if, say for example, you're doing a swatch, you just have to keep that in mind, that whichever row you're on, say you want to do your 2 rows of contrast yarn, then you would want to probably knit a few rows in stockinette, set your tension dial for marking out your eyelets, and you can follow the video that I have on making a swatch. It's done in exactly the same way, it's just you have to keep in mind whether you're doing simple or fully fashioned lace, your row counter. So my lace card is in and locked. I'm going to pattern my drums. I haven't changed any of the settings on my carriage, so it's still going to knit stockinette. And now I'm ready to change the settings. So we're doing simple lace, so we're going to keep this to the front. But we now want to pattern. So we're going to push our side levers back to tell the carriage that I want to start collecting from the patterning. And then I want to unlock the card so that as this passes, the card will start to advance. Now, one important thing you'll want to place in before you start to knit are the edge pins that we showed earlier. So depending on what type of lace carriage you have will depend on what size of lace pin you have. So we're going to go in for a close-up to show how we fit those. And the reason we fit them is so that the end needles, when we look at our needle strip, our number strip, we can see where the pattern repeats are going to be. Well, if this is the edge of my work and in the pattern that needle wants to transfer whilst I'm going left to right, it's going to transfer that working needle to an empty needle, which of course it's not going to engage the empty needle, so it's going to drop the stitch. So these effectively cancel out, allowing the end needles to transfer. So one way we put them in, with the legs facing us, you can see it doesn't pull all the way down to the groove. That will get caught in the carriage. So what we want to do is take the centre two legs. Now this is exactly the same for the narrower one, and we're lining these up with the end two needles, placing it into the slot and bringing it forwards. And what that does is it stops the needle from pulling all the way forward with its legs so that it won't transfer. And you add these on both sides. So we paused before we were ready to start knitting to fit the edge pins. We're still set how we were before for simple lace, patterning, unlocked. So on simple lace, the carriage will trip the row counter every time. And you can see as we move across, the needles that are being selected become lifted up by this flat piece of metal here, up onto this thin piece, and again they're transferred in the direction that the carriage is passed. So you can have a look and see what you think of the lace pattern. And again, if you're doing this in a swatch, you'll be sure to mark off your starting and end rows and your needles. But you may want to switch to some stockinette, so you may just want a band of lace. Well, to switch to stockinette, you would first want to ensure that your card is locked, and you bring your side levers forwards. This cancels the patterning function, and we'll just knit plain stockinette. So now we're going to swap out to the fully fashioned lace card. So when I'm selecting my cards, normally what I like to do is take the one out of the reader, place it back in to the set so that things don't get muddled up. I'm going to take the little leaflet with this one, which has a lot of transferred lace. And I might have a go at this one, so I'm looking for card 412, which is the second card in the set. And so that I know I have taken a card from the set, rather than put this all back together and put the leaflet in front, I'm actually going to put the leaflet in the place of the card that I've used before I place it back into its wallet. Another thing you can do, particularly if you have multiple machines that you're using at the same time, is you can put a piece of washi tape or a sticky label or a post-it note, and you can write on it which card you've removed. So in this case I would say put a piece of tape on, write 412 out, meaning it's out of the set and being used, so that if I put that back into my storage system, I'll be able to see straight away that the set is incomplete because the card is being used. So let's go change out this card. So we've changed out the card for our fully fashioned card. So we can see the red boxes on the right hand column here. And the arrow is telling me to go from right to left. I haven't locked the card. I need to lock the card because I need to repattern the drums to this card. So I'm still set for stockinette, and I'm just going to pass the carriage twice to set the drums. So I'm going to keep you at this angle so that you can not only see the instructions on the card, but the adjustments that I'm making to the carriage. So I've pre-patterned the drums. The first two rows, it has a white section, so that means that it's going to be cam forward, and we want the carriage to pattern, so both side levers are going back. And we want to unlock the card. So now we're ready to knit. Our edge pins are in place, carriage is set to pattern, card is unlocked, we already have the pattern in the drums, and the front cam is forward because we're on a white section. Now we're on a red section, so this is where we need to make the adjustments. The only adjustment we make is the cam lever to P, so that it only does the transfers. But what we want to remember is we want to unthread the carriage. If you forget to thread the carriage, it may work, but it could also more likely jam. And you pass the carriage for the required number of rows that are in red, which in that case were 2. And now we're on to white. So rethread the carriage. Again, ensure the thread is correctly in the feeder. Turning the cam lever to O. Now this is essentially, when you look at the card, when you see the holes, what you will have is a break in the hole section. So these are the transfers, and then this would be the plain knit. That's why we change from P to O. P does all the transfers and the O does the knit. So I'm now into red again. Cam lever, unthread. You can either hold the yarn forward or you can place it into the little clip on the far side of the bed. And every time, this is your instructions as to what you're doing with the carriage setting and the thread. This will take a lot more passes of the carriage, but again, because we disengage the row tripper automatically when we turn it to do the transfers, it's not going to affect your row count. Now you may find I only have the one weight on here. You may find if you're getting dropped stitches, it may be too much weight. It could also be not enough weight. It could be the angle of the bed. Each machine and carriage has its own temperament. What I would recommend, particularly if you're working on a rather large piece, is that every now and again you would thread in a lifeline. So if you have either your double-eyed bodkin or a darning needle at hand, and go through with a high contrast thread, or say your high contrast Ravel cord, and you want to do it on one of the plain rows. So in this instance I'm on red, so I'm going to take this out. Complete the transfers, set it back, you can decide whether you want to insert the lifeline on the first row or on the second row. The second row would give you complete stitches rather than the yarn overs or the loops that are just laid into the hooks. But when you put the lifeline in, make a note of not only your row counter, but also which row the card is sitting on. I would recommend that every, say, 10 or 20 rows that you knit in, so when you're on the white sections, every 10th row, ideally, particularly if it is quite a busy pattern over a large area, the more times that you spend putting a lifeline in, the less likely you're going to have to start it all over again. Now let's say as a beginner, just as you're getting used to doing fully fashioned lace, that you turn your cam lever setting but you forget to take out the yarn. And it transfers fine, but you can see the yarn has been left in the front. Sometimes people have gotten away without removing the yarn, and other times this can get caught up if there are needles to be transferred on the next pass. Like here. So my carriage is now jammed. I can't move it left and I can't move it right. Now the unfortunate thing with Knitmasters is that due to the way they're seated onto the main bed, the carriage rides on a tube. So there's no way that you can loosen that to lift the carriage off. And we can see in here, this is what is causing the jam. So somewhere in here, the yarn has got caught up on these metal plates that are in the sinker plate. So ideally what we want to do is remove that yarn off of that top plate, make sure there's nothing on these top plates, and we're going to disengage our sinker plate just by unscrewing the thumb screws here, and we're going to remove the sinker plate and unthread the yarn. Now your carriage may want to move then, but you could end up distorting the needles. So what I would recommend you do is lift and move back. The lifting of the carriage disengages the channel that the needle butts would run in. And we can see where the yarn has just wanted to catch on these. So what I'm doing is I'm lifting the yarn back out, and I'm going to place it over onto the right hand side. Effectively what we're doing is resetting back to our first row. So I'm going to want to move my card reader back until it's on the first red line, and I'm going to replace any of the stitches that had been transferred, just using my latch tool to catch the stitch and lifting it off and moving it over into its empty needle. All of the needles are full. Again, placing these back into B position, locking the card because we don't want it to advance as we pass the carriage now. I'm keeping my cam lever on the P so that the row tripper doesn't count. And what I'm going to do is lift the carriage as I pass it over. And what this is doing, you can hear, is resetting the pattern into the drums. And again, we haven't affected our row counter because we kept it on the P setting, and we're ready to start these transfers again by unlocking the card, replacing our sinker plate, and starting the transfers again with the yarn unthreaded this time. And again, if you'd had a lifeline in there, it might have made it easier to know which row to rip back to. So you should be able to create lace swatches so that you can work out garments in the same way that we create a standard swatch. Again, just keeping in mind where to place the contrast yarn to mark the needle size. But in our first club session where we covered lace, we were having a play around with the simple lace technique, and we tried it on quite a loose tension to begin with. This is a thin cotton mix yarn, slightly thinner than 4-ply. And then we decided to tighten up the tension slightly to get a more uniformed effect. And then we thought, well, would we be able to use some poodle or boucle type yarn, which you can see here has quite a fluffy finish to it. And we were able to add that in with the teal coloured yarn. Because it is quite thin, it didn't add too much thickness. But by doing that, because this was a variegated boucle yarn, it sort of lost the pattern in the lace work here. Looks fantastic in the stockinette, and I'd definitely consider changing it in for the stockinette, but just not with the lace with that colour. And then we decided to try it on its own to see how the colour would fare. And on its own, it came out quite well. We did tighten the tension because it is such a thin yarn. However, being more cautious, I decided that to turn this into a garment, I would rather pair it with a single strand. But I didn't want to use a dark colour, so I opted instead to pair it with a single strand of white, so that it hasn't taken away from the colour of the swatch. But if I was to wear a dark item underneath, say a vest, then we would still be able to see the lace work quite effectively. If you're interested in any of the virtual events that I host online, you can find me over on Instagram at dunfermline.machine.knitting. I do a lot of voluntary work with the local Scottish Machine Knitters Association, where we host online workshops, online make-alongs, as well as monthly social events for our members. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the thumbs up button if you enjoyed this video. Feel free to leave a comment, and until the next time, you've been watching Button Mouse the Wee Machine Knitter.